Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. It's been a while since I've done a Steam Deck emulation video, so we're going to change that today. Let's talk about RetroDECK. And I think the easiest way to describe RetroDECK is as an all-in-one emulation solution. Everything is contained in one single app, including all the emulators that you need to get up and running. In addition, everything is going to be pre-configured, so all of the games will work as intended as well. And while I think that other emulation solutions out there like EmuDeck give you a little bit more freedom and bells and whistles, I really like just the simple nature of RetroDECK. And so in this video, I'm going to walk you through the installation process and some of my favorite features as well. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's begin by talking about the differences between RetroDECK and EmuDeck. And like I mentioned in the intro, RetroDECK is a self-contained app. That means that you will just download one app and all the emulators will come pre-installed. On the other hand, EmuDeck, which I have installed on this Steam Deck, is a little bit different. It's more like a tool that will take all the disparate parts of the emulators that are available on the internet and then download them and configure them for you. So RetroDECK is an all-in-one self-contained solution, whereas EmuDeck is more like a choose-your-own-adventure. Now there is good and bad that comes with each of these two different setups. The first is that with RetroDECK as a self-contained single image, when you get an update will only be when the updates get pushed from the app itself. There are ways to go and update the individual emulators, but for the most part you will be updating them on a recurring basis when you update RetroDECK. Meanwhile, with EmuDeck, you would manage all of your emulators individually, so you can update them, you can update your configurations, or you can just go one by one. Like I said, this is more like a collection of all of your emulation into one, whereas RetroDECK is just a single image. The other major difference between the two is how emulation is presented within the Steam Deck UI. With RetroDECK, it's just a single app, so you would open this app and that will contain all of your games and you'll navigate through there. It is essentially using Emulation Station as its front end. Now EmuDeck also has the ability to use Emulation Station Desktop Edition. In fact, you can see it right there, so I can always jump into all my games from there, but then also I have individual ROM files that are presented within SteamOS. And this is done using a tool called Steam ROM Manager, which I cover in my EmuDeck guides. Now, RetroDECK also will allow you to create single app files like this, and I'll show you how to do that later in this video, but by default, it's just going to be that one single app. So I would say that by default, RetroDECK will give you a cleaner environment. It's just going to be all of your emulation in one and then all of your Steam games. Something like EmuDeck is going to be a mix and match where I have my emulated games that are interspersed with my actual PC games as well. And I think both approaches have their merits. It's really going to come down to what you personally prefer. And I should also mention that performance between the two will be roughly the same. And so this video is not intended to push you one way or the other, because I think they are both excellent tools. Instead, I just wanted to show the difference between the two in case you already have EmuDeck set up. And so this essentially is what RetroDECK is going to look like. You'll be able to navigate through all of your systems in one single app, and then you will pick your games from here, and they'll launch, and everything will be just universally configured. And so it's a very simple process to get everything set up, and the navigation experience is very similar to EmuDeck. You can also go and configure things like different themes and whatnot within Emulation Station as well. And finally, the last big difference between the two is that this one actually has official PortMaster support. Now, if you're not familiar with PortMaster, this is a tool that allows you to play PC games directly on lower-powered Linux-based handhelds. It's a little bit odd to have it on the Steam Deck since this can already play PC games, but there is some merit here. And that's because PortMaster has over 400 free-to-run games directly within its interface. So if you want to compile them all together into an easy-to-download area, then I think PortMaster is a really good tool here. Okay, now that we have a general understanding of what RetroDECK is and what it can bring to the table, let's now talk about the actual installation process. And I should also note that RetroDECK doesn't necessarily require a Steam Deck to work. If you are using something that's running Bazite, which is a SteamOS-like operating system, for example on an ROG Ally or something similar, it's going to work there as well. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we need to leave the SteamOS game mode and go into desktop mode. You'll find that within Power and then switch to desktop. Now, once you're here in the desktop mode, we want to go down to the Discover app, which is kind of like their app store. Once you have it open, search for the word RetroDECK and you can install it right here. The app itself is relatively large, and that's because it contains all of the emulator apps within it. So it will take a few minutes to download and install, but once it's ready, let's go ahead and launch it. And when you first open it up, it's going to give you a choice of where you want to install all of your ROM folders. You can choose the default internal storage or on a micro SD card, or you can also just set it to a custom location as well. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use internal storage, but you obviously can put it wherever you would like. After that, you'll get another info box that'll tell you about the next window, which is going to have some pre-configuration of firmware files. And in the installation process, there are 3 things that RetroDECK offers to install. First, it's going to be the Steam input profiles, and these are going to be installed by default, and I would recommend leaving these in. Now, in addition to that, it will optionally install the PS3 and PS Vita firmware files if you do plan on playing those systems. And that's because these files are already available on Sony's website, so it's just doing you a solid by basically saying that we will download and install them for you so you don't have to do it. So to be thorough, I am going to choose those, and if you do choose them, it is going to give you a couple dialog boxes afterwards saying, hey, we're going to install these things just to let you know. And so let me show you what it's like if you do plan on installing the PS3 firmware files. It's going to go through into the back end and then download the file. And once it's been downloaded, it's going to open up the PS3 emulator and then ask you whether or not you want to install the firmware. And then after you confirm, it's going to install it. And then after that, it'll tell you it's good to go. Now, one thing about the PS3 emulator is that it will compile the modules for the firmware the first time around. So if you see a screen like this, don't freak out. It just means that it's installing the firmware and this is the last step. And this will usually take several minutes, somewhere between like 3 or 5. Now, speaking of PS3, we're not going to go into the weeds too much about talking about PS3 emulation, and that's because each of these individual emulators have a really good wiki guide on the RetroDECK wiki. And so here you can learn about which file types it requires and how to actually make it show up within RetroDECK and everything else. And so I will leave a link to their wiki guide below if you want to get more in the weeds about some of these individual emulators. For now, I just wanted to show that yes, it'll pre-install the firmware for you, which is pretty handy. Once that's done, you can exit out of the RPCS3 app, and then it'll start the PS Vita firmware download. This one doesn't have any fancy dialog boxes, it's just going to download everything and then you'll be good. From there, RetroDECK will finish up the installation, then give you a dialog box letting you know that everything is good to go. After that, it's going to tell you where to put your game files and your BIOS files. So let's do that next. Now, by default, I stored everything on internal storage, which means I'm going to find it directly on my Steam Deck. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my File Explorer, then go into Home, and then from there, I'll go into Deck, and you should now see a RetroDECK folder. Now, when we open up the RetroDECK folder, you're going to see a bunch of different options, including like a saves folder, but what we really want to focus on here is the BIOS and ROMs folders. Let's start with the BIOS folder first, and BIOS files are specific system files that are necessary for certain emulators to run. The vast majority of emulators won't require it, but there are quite a few key ones that will. And again, I think that the best place to learn about these BIOS files and which ones you need and their location is going to be that RetroDECK wiki. And of note, BIOS files, like ROMs files, are copyrighted, so you're not going to find any links to them directly. Regardless, this should help you on your way in terms of getting it all set up. And to make things a little bit easier for you, here is a graphic that contains all of the major BIOS files that you would need for the systems that need it. So your best bet is to find the files that are named like this and then put them in that BIOS folder. And like I mentioned, not every system requires BIOS files. Even for something like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, it is optional. If you add the BIOS files, it'll give you a boot logo, but if you don't, it won't. And of note, there are many different PlayStation and PlayStation 2 BIOS files, so I just put one example for each. It's also worth noting that RetroDECK has its own BIOS checker tool within its configurator app, and we will check that out here later in this video once we have it set up. But again, as a quick summary, just grab your BIOS files and put them into this BIOS folder. Now, moving over the ROMs can be easier or harder depending on whether or not you already have them. In this setup here, on the left side, I have the RetroDECK ROMs folder already open, and on the right side, I've taken an external drive and I've plugged it into my Steam Deck, and so now I'm just going to drag and drop my files from one to the other. And like I mentioned before, ROM files are copyrighted, so I'm not going to have any links to any of that stuff. You're going to have to find them on your own. But again, this is a very simple process, and also within each of these ROM folders, there is a system info text file. If you open that up, it'll tell you which file types it actually accepts. And again, if you run into any problems, I would recommend checking out that RetroDECK wiki, because they've got a page for basically every emulator out there, and it'll tell you all the things you need to know. Okay, at this point, we have now added our BIOS and ROMs files, and we are ready to actually start rocking with RetroDECK. First thing you want to do is, still in desktop mode, open up Steam. And then on the bottom left, you will see an option that says Add a Game. From there, choose Add a Non-Steam Game, and it'll give you a list of everything that's installed on the computer, and near the bottom, you should find RetroDECK. Now, just click on RetroDECK and then choose Add Selected Program. This means that when we go back into SteamOS, we will find RetroDECK right there on the front screen. However, when you first open it up, it's not going to have any sort of pretty artwork. It's just going to be a blank box. So now I'm going to show you really quickly how to make this prettier. Now, there are many ways that you can add art to your games, including a plugin, which is actually pretty handy, but a little bit more advanced. And because this is only one app, we're just going to do it manually because it is very fast. So back in desktop mode, we're going to open up our web browser and we're going to navigate to this website, which is steamgriddb.com. And this is a repository for a bunch of different art assets for Steam games. In the search menu, we're just going to search for the word RetroDECK and it should pop right up. And within here, you'll find a bunch of different art assets, including vertical and horizontal art, and we're going to grab one of each. Let's start with our vertical art, and I like this one right here. It's got a nice kind of gradient to it. So we're going to click on it and then click on download, and then we're going to save this image. I'm going to give it a quick name in front of it just to remember which one it is, and so I'm going to call this one the tall image. Now I want to grab a horizontal image. This is what's going to show up when this is our #1 game on the far left. Again, I'm going to use a very similar design so that way it kind of looks the same between the two. However, this time I'm going to name it the hero just to make sure I can remember it. After that, we need our banner, which is going to be a widescreen image that shows up when you click on the game. I recommend getting a blank one because we're going to add a logo on top of it afterwards. So I'm going to grab this one. And I'm going to name this one wide just to make sure I remember it. And then finally, we need to grab that logo. So I'm going to grab this one right here and same thing. I'm just going to save it and then I'm going to call it logo. Okay, once you have those 4 images downloaded, we now need to add them to the game within Steam. So open up Steam. And then right there on the front, you should see RetroDECK. So let's go ahead and right click on it and then click Manage. Now choose the option that says Set Custom Artwork. And this is going to be that hero image that we installed before. By default, it's going to look for a JPEG, but most likely it's going to be a PNG. So just change it to all files and then you can find it. And after choosing hero and hitting OK, you should now see it right there. Now, if we click on the game, you will see that this is where the banner and logo go. Let's right click on the back thing here and then select Set Custom Background. And same thing here, we'll change it to be able to see PNG files and then grab our wide image. So now that we have our banner, let's go ahead and add that logo. So same thing here, we're going to go in and grab the logo image. And so there we go, I think it looks pretty sharp. So let's now add our vertical version. There's a couple different ways that you can do this to get the vertical orientation to show up, but for me, I found the easiest way is to go into my collections and then my installed locally files. This will show all my games in one grid, and from there I can find RetroDECK, and you can see that, yeah, it doesn't have that vertical image. Same thing, we'll right click here, go to Manage, and then Set Custom Artwork. And then we'll grab our tall image, and there we go. We've now added all of the custom artwork for it. And now when we jump back into the app, you can see that, yeah, we've got all of the artwork there. It looks wonderful. Now let's open up RetroDECK and check it out. And probably the first thing you're going to notice is that you will see all of these systems here listed, at least any of the systems that you added ROMs for. However, as you navigate through these systems, you will find that there is no artwork for any of these games. It's going to say game media missing. Now at this point, the games are still going to work. So we can start up a game, it's going to work just fine, and then we can exit out of it by pressing select and start at the same time. But first thing I want to show you here is how to scrape all of your artwork so that you can see all of your box art as you're navigating through. I think it really enhances the experience. So we're going to press start to bring up the main menu and then go into scraper. From there, go down to the third section, it'll say scrape these systems. What you can do is hit the R2 button to go all the way to the bottom and then choose select all. This means it's going to grab all of the artwork for all of the ROMs that you have already installed. In the next section, it's going to ask for your account settings. So this is where you're going to need to add your screenscraper.fr username and password. And this is totally free to set up, so you just need to sign up for this and then get that username and password and add it here. For the next two options, I would just leave them at default, but under other settings, I would recommend changing out the region if you would like. By default, it's going to be set to world, but I personally like the US box art, so I'm going to choose that. From there, just back out to the main scraper menu and then select start. And from there, it's going to scrape through the database, find all of your games, and then download the box art for them. And depending on the size of your library, this could take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours. For example, I loaded up 728 emulated games here with this particular setup, and this took me about 2.5 hours altogether to scrape everything. So this is a great time to kick back, maybe watch a favorite movie with your significant other, and then you'll be ready to go. Okay, so after everything is scraped, this is what it's going to look like. You can navigate through your systems, and then as you go, you'll be able to see your box art. And if you pause for a moment, it's actually going to play a video right here in the background as well. And so I think this is a pretty neat little way of actually showing off all of your games, and you can, navigate them all in one place. It is worth noting that this is a custom theme made for Emulation Station Desktop Edition for RetroDECK, and I think it looks pretty great. It definitely has a more retro vibe to it, but that's one of the things I love about, retro game emulation. Now, if you'd like, you can also change the user interface to make it more standard. So you can just press Start here, go into the ESDE configurations, and then under UI settings, there's the theme downloader. It's going to give you a warning the first time you do it, just letting you know it's going to take a while to load it that first time around. But once it's ready to go, you will have a listing of all the different themes that you can choose from, and you can download them directly here. Let's download the Artbook Next one, because this one has a lot of different configurations that you can do. So I'm just going to hit A here, and then it's going to take a moment to download. Once it's done, you can press the B button to get back to the UI settings. And now under Theme, you can see that we have other options, including Artbook Next. So once you click on that, press B again, and then that'll back out to the main settings. And now you can see that, yes, we've got everything set up here with Artbook Next. Now, we can still navigate through and see all of our games and everything. All of these scraped media is going to work on any of these different themes. And so we're already well set up. And it is worth noting that one of my favorite things about Artbook Next is that you can configure it even more. So if we go back into ESDE configurations, UI settings, for example, under theme color scheme, you've got a bunch of different options. And I'm going to go all the way to the bottom. That's going to be all the OLED options. And this is an OLED Steam Deck. And some of my favorite options here is circuit and outline. Let's do circuit first. So I'm going to choose that and then back out to the main menu. And so now you have a circuit board of each of these systems. And I think that looks pretty awesome. And so this gives a real retro vibe altogether. And it's just one of my favorite themes and looks. I also really like the outline option as well. Let's take a look at that one. So this one's a bit more colorful, but you can see it's got the same kind of look and feel as Artbook Next, but it just has, this really nice, vibrant kind of primary color look to it as well. So either way, that's a quick look at some of the configurations that you can do in the UI. So you're not going to be stuck with the RetroDECK theme if you don't want it. You can change it to whatever you would like. Now, while we're still in the settings menu, let me show you some of the other things that you can do within RetroDECK. Let's start with ESD configuration again, and let's go down to game collection settings. Here you can actually make automatic game collections. You can see that already your favorites and last played are showing up, but say for example you don't want to see your last played, you can uncheck that and now it's not going to show up. You can also create custom collections as well. Essentially what you do here is you give it a name and then you go through and you pick all the games that you want added to that custom collection. Say for example if you wanted to have fighting games, you would put the word fighting here, then choose all your fighting games and then you'd be good to go. Also within the ESD configurations menu is other settings, and this one's going to be important for alternative emulators. Within here, it's going to show you all the default emulators for each of your systems, and you may have specific preferences one over the other. Now, these are all pre-configured by the RetroDECK team, so they've already chosen the defaults, and then also, they've pre-configured each of them as well. So really, I would only recommend changing these out if you know what you're doing. Personally, I think they did a good job choosing all the defaults, so I'm not going to change any of this myself. Now, back in the main menu, let's talk about the RetroDECK configurator. And this is an app that allows you to do a bunch of under-the-hood stuff within RetroDECK. You can do this within desktop mode or here in game mode, but if you are going to use it in game mode, I would recommend using a USB mouse. So I've got this USB mouse plugged in with USB-C, and so now we can go into the RetroDECK configurator. And I know it's a little bit hard to see because the text is kind of small, but you can see we have a bunch of different options here. Let's go into presets and settings. Now here we can actually change both our global and RetroArch as well as our Wii and GameCube settings. So within global, you can see we've got a bunch of options. For example, we can enable and disable widescreen hacks for certain emulated systems. We can turn on the confirm to exit for some of these, or we can do things like autosave and auto-load. This is also where you would go and add your RetroAchievement login, and then also you could log out if you would like as well. And so this kind of lets you get into the weeds with some of these configurations depending on what you want to get into. For example, within the RetroArch section, you can enable or disable overlays if you want to see those on the sides of the screen as you're playing. Another thing you can do under here is actually open up each of your individual emulators. It's going to say, hey, are you sure you want to do this? You're going to hit yes, but you can see that yes, you can actually open up each of these individual emulators. So this is where you could go through and actually update them individually if you would like. But personally, I would say that it may bring more problems than solutions by updating these apps all the time, because RetroDECK is a self-contained system, so I would just wait for the next version of RetroDECK if you can. Under the RetroDECK Tools section, we've got a bunch of other options here, including if you wanted to move your folders, say for example to an SD card or from an SD card, you can do that right here. You can also remove the empty ROMs folders. If you know that you've added all the games you want to, you're not going to add any other games for any other systems, you can choose to remove them. That's actually going to make Emulation Station boot up a little bit faster. You can also just automatically compress all of your games to CHD files, for example. So this is a really handy tool as well. Also within the troubleshooting section, this is where you can verify your BIOS files. If you choose this, it's going to scan through all the folders, find your BIOS files, and then tell you which ones you have and which ones are missing. This is also where you can go to back up some of your user files. Say, for example, you want to save off your save games because you're going to be maybe reinstalling SteamOS on a different machine. You can do that here. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is Steam Sync. So this is going to allow you to create individual game files that will show up within SteamOS. Now, in order to get that to work, the first thing you have to do is go through and make some favorites. So let's go into Super Nintendo. Let's say, for example, Aero the Acrobat. I want to make this one of the games that shows up within SteamOS, not just within the RetroDECK app. So what I can do is press the Y button, and that's going to make it a favorite. It'll actually move it to the front of the list, so now it's over here. Let's do it for one more game. Let's do Freedom Fighters on the GameCube. One of my favorite GameCube games of all time, by the way. So I'm going to press the Y button again, make it a favorite, and now you will see it over here on the far left. So now let's go back into the RetroDECK configurator and actually set it up. So back in the tool here, let's go to Steam Sync. It's going to say that it is currently disabled. Do you want to enable it? We're going to hit yeah, man, I want to do it. From that, it's going to say Steam synchronization is enabled. We can hit OK. Now we're going to quit out of the configurator, and then also we want to quit out of RetroDECK. And you'll see that as we quit it, it's going to sync these. And what it's basically doing is going into Steam ROM Manager and making profiles for those games that we made as favorites. If you've got a lot of games that you're making favorites, this might take quite some time, but if it's only one or two, it'll take maybe, like 30 seconds to a minute. Now, once we're back into just regular old SteamOS, we need to reset Steam. And the easiest way to do that is actually just to reset your Steam Deck. So I'm going to restart it. And so now that I'm back into the operating system, let's go over into Library and let's go over to our non-Steam games. And you can see that, yeah, there we go. We've got RetroDECK as well as Freedom Fighters and Aero the Acrobat. And if we start up one of these games, you will see that it has all the artwork and it should launch it right here. And so there we go. We've got Aero the Acrobat running, and all I had to do was just create it with that Steam Sync option. And now to exit out of the game, we're going to press Select and Start twice, and we will be back in the main menu. It's also worth noting that within RetroArch, it is going to auto-save and auto-load your game. So if we start up Aero the Acrobat again, it's going to take us right back to where we were, which was the main title screen. And so there we go. It automatically saved where we were, and we are now good to go. And to top that off, if we go back into the main menu, you can see that yes, Aero the Acrobat has its own menu item now. And so essentially that is how RetroDECK works. You can go through, pick your game, and then start it up here, but you can also make it a favorite. And by making it a favorite, it'll show up within Steam. So now we're basically ready to start playing our games, but I do have a couple tips and tricks to help you when you're actually playing. The first thing is that you want to change your controller layout for this game. So while you have RetroDECK open, just press the Steam button and then go into controller settings. You can see that by default, they're just using, your standard gamepad with joystick trackpad. So we want to change this one out. To do that, we're going to select it and then scroll all the way down till you find the RetroDECK ones. And I recommend using the full one. And to enable it, you would press the A button and then press the X button to apply the layout. And that's it. From now on, you should see the RetroDECK setup, and it's going to apply to any game that you launch from here. And so let's start up a random game. This is Good Boy Galaxy on the Game Boy Advance. Now what I can do is use the pre-configured hotkeys. For example, if I press Select and Y, that'll bring up the RetroArch quick menu. And depending on what app you're using, say for example with PS2, pressing this hotkey will bring up the menu for that one as well. In addition, we can press Select and R2 to bring up fast forward. Unfortunately, it's a hold to fast forward as opposed to a toggle. I prefer a toggle, but that's how they have it set up. We can also do save states by pressing Select and R1 to save a state, and then we can select and L1 to do a load state. And so that's a quick way to be able to save and load your game as you're playing. And on the RetroDECK wiki, they've got a bunch of hotkey options as well, so you can read through these if you want to know a little bit more, but those are the basics that I generally will use. And to exit a game, all you have to do is just press select and start twice in RetroArch or once in the other apps. Now, another thing worth noting, within RetroDECK, if you don't want to use the hotkeys, you can use a radial menu instead that they have already created. So within here, you can do like quick settings, so we can go in there, and then you can do things like, save your state, load your state, things like that. You can even do things like, quit the emulator from here. So it's all pretty simple. There are also quite a few things you can do within here without having to pop into the emulator. For example, under display and graphics, we can go and increase the resolution and upscaling. So for example, right now I'm running it at a 2x resolution upscale with PS2, and it's because I was able to do that. You can also adjust the aspect ratio right here. And so this is really handy depending on the emulator that you're using to be able to mess around with some of these settings. It's all going to really be contextual based on the emulator that you're using, but it's pretty handy if you're trying to get into something within the menu without knowing exactly what hotkeys to hit. You can just use the left trackpad instead. It's one of the cooler things about RetroDECK. Okay, so now that we're set up and you can play all your retro games, let's talk about non-retro games. Let's talk about PortMaster. So all you have to do for this is just go into the PortMaster section and then start up PortMaster itself. And it is worth noting that PortMaster just came to the RetroDECK platform like last week with their most recent update, so it's really cool that they're working on it. And I've got a full guide about PortMaster that I made on this channel. I'll leave it linked down below. And admittedly, PortMaster on a Steam Deck is not quite as useful as it is on like a retro handheld that can't play PC games, but still I think it's a nice added bonus. And like I mentioned, the ready-to-run ports are really what I think are special because these are the games that you can install directly onto the device without having to hunt them down. Now, it is worth noting that not all of the games are showing up here. For example, there are over 400 ready-to-run games within PortMaster, but you can see that the list is pretty limited here. And again, this probably just has to do with compatibility and the fact that this just got PortMaster onto RetroDECK, so there's still some work that needs to be done. But I want to show you how easy it is to actually install these games. So let's try Friday Night Funkin' right here. So I'm going to press A to learn more about it, and then I'm going to press A again to install it. From there, it'll go into the servers, it'll download the file, and whatever dependencies are required to make it run. And after it's done installing, you'll get something like this showing that it's installed successfully. So we are ready to go. So now I'm going to exit out of PortMaster, and now what we need to do is refresh PortMaster so we can see the other ports. So I'm going to press Start here and go into Utilities, and then we're going to rescan ROM directory. What this is doing is basically looking for additional files that were added since the last time you opened it up. And now if we go into PortMaster, we should see this as an option. And sure enough, there we go. We've got Friday Night Funkin' and then of course regular PortMaster. And so now we should be able to just launch this game. And yeah, there we go. We've got Friday Night Funkin' running here on this device. I think that's pretty awesome. And again, this is, just an added bonus to the whole emulation thing in the first place. We've got a bunch of other games that we can run here. And really, that's about it when it comes to getting RetroDECK up and running. It's a very simple process. It's all a single app, and I love the fact that it's all self-contained. I also appreciate the fact that if you want, you can make individual game files as well, and it's pretty easy to set up too. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you already using emulation on your Steam Deck? Do you use a tool like EmuDeck or RetroDECK? Or do you just install all the individual emulators yourself? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.